Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. A very warm welcome to yet another session of Quest, the interview segment that we have been doing for quite some time. Today we have a special guest, Shri Richard C. Miller, and who is a clinical psychologist. And before we proceed further, let me begin with a small prayer. सदाशिवसमारम्भां शङ्कराचार्यमध्यमाम् अस्मदाचार्यपर्यन्तां वन्दे गुरुपरम्पराम् श्रीगुरुभ्यो नमः हरि ओम. Shri Richard Miller ji is a clinical psychologist, author, researcher, yogic scholar, and a spiritual teacher who has dedicated his life for integrating Western psychology and neuroscience with ancient wisdom, teachings of yoga, tantra, Advaita, Taoism, Buddhism, and other Eastern traditions. He is the founder of iRest Institute, co-founder of International Association of Yoga Therapists, and former president of Institute for Spirituality and Psychology. He is also a developer of the research-based program called iRest Yoga Nidra Meditation, and we will be discussing more about this program in today's session. And he is the author of the book Yoga Nidra, the iRest meditative practice for deep relaxation and healing, and the iRest program for healing PTSD. So Richard ji does a lot of activities. He does retreats, trainings internationally, emphasizing a more meaningful and enlightening living in daily life. We are very glad to have you, Richard ji, on our show. Thank you for coming on this show.
Thank you for having me. It's a delight to be here with you and everyone.
As you know, this interview program is about where we interview our guests about their life journey, especially their journey into the holistic, the spiritual traditions, and how it has impacted their own personal life. So let me begin with the opening question. Tell us about your background, your life journey. How did you get introduced to these Eastern spiritual and knowledge traditions such as yoga, Vedanta, etc.? Tell us a bit about this part of your journey.
Sure. Well, I always like to say when people ask me, how did I get here? I always like to say it's a mystery. How do any of us get here? It's something that moves within us deeply. So I can go all the way back to when I was a little boy. I used to play in the woods, hang out with the animals, the birds and the squirrels. And I was always partial to nature and felt the great silence that I would experience when I would walk out in nature during all the different seasons of the year. When I was 13, though, I had a specific experience one evening in Florida during a spring vacation when I was visiting my grandmother, and I took a walk and was lying down looking at the evening sky. And I think I was around 14 or 15, I asked myself, I wonder where the end of the universe is. So I gazed out into the evening stars, and as a adolescent boy, I imagined a brick wall as the end of the universe. But then my curiosity got the better of me, and I wondered what's on the other side of the brick wall. And I jumped over, and I kept doing that over and over and over until this moment where everything dissolved, and I felt myself as the universe itself, not separate. Flash forward into my early 20s, and I was studying psychology, and I took on a mentor, a woman by the name of Laura Cummings, who had just recently come from the Far East. She had been born and raised in the Far East, being taught yoga by her mother and raised in a more Buddhist community. And so she began to help me integrate psychology and these Eastern traditions. along with our studies together, I, with her, under her tutelage, had more of these moments where I felt myself completely in tune with the universe. I happened to be new to San Francisco, where I was had just recently moved, and I took a yoga class trying to meet people. And I like to say, while the class was held in silence for 12 weeks, I didn't really meet anybody, but I did meet myself, because at the end of the first class, the teacher brought us into what I now know was a rudimentary yoga nidra practice. And again, I had the most amazing experience of feeling one with the universe and not separate. Excuse me. And I walked out that evening wondering, one, what had just happened to me? What was this practice I had done, and how could I learn more? And that really began deepening me into my, what I would call my search. And with Laura's help, and then I was very fortunate back in the early 70s, many fine teachers from all over the world were traveling through the Bay Area. So I began to meet teacher after teacher from the Far East and really began to explore my own direct experience with the help of my mentors, and slowly gained more and more insight. So that sense of no separation began to stabilize. And I remember one evening, it's about 1996, I woke up from my sleep and I couldn't go back to sleep. So I got up, sat by my bedroom door, looking out again on the night sky. And all of a sudden, that sense of oneness just flooded me. And I would say since then, it's never left. Along the way, I began to look at psychology and how were the teachings, often from the spiritual perspective, sometimes missing the integration of the psychological, and sometimes the psychological was missing the integration of the spiritual. And for me, they are not separate. They're two halves of one coin. I think for me, as I've grown and opened spiritual awakening of non-separation, non-dualism, I realized there were aspects of my psychology that weren't fully integrated. And so I really spent time looking at how can the Eastern teachings complement the Western teachings? How can the Western teachings of psychology complement the Eastern teachings? And as I explored Patanjali, Advaita, Kashmir Shaivism, plus my studies in Taoism and Buddhism, I found a wonderful way to integrate these so that when I work either with myself or with another, I'm looking for that integration where a person is helping resolve any unresolved psychological issues so that they become a fully integrated human being. I like to say operating on all 12 cylinders and awake to this within them that has always been whole, never was injured or hurt, and doesn't need healing, and to awaken to that really deep essence, I would say, that we all share in common. And it's a delight now because as I walk through my life, while like here we're meeting face to face, I like to say we're actually meeting essence to essence, the underlying essence that for me is birth, the entire cosmos, and each one of us as an expression, so we can celebrate our wonderful differences and honor this essence that we all hold in common. So my journey has spanned now 74 years, and it feels a delight to be sitting here with you and just sharing these moments like we should all be doing. So that's a little bit of my story, you might say.
That is a very fascinating account, especially your account about the non-dual experience you had multiple times in your life. That must have been a very, very powerful experience, something that has left a strong imprint and affected your whole life, all aspects of your life, work and family and everything, I believe.
Yeah, and when I look back over my decades, I realized I always had this innate curiosity to ask these questions about who am I? What is another? How did we get here? What is all of this? So those questions were really deeply embedded in me as an early child that kept my curiosity looking for answers until I found my way through to what I would call the answers to those questions.
You said that you did study about the Vedanta, yoga, Buddhism, and Tao system. So, did you study this on your own, or did you study this under any formal teachers? How did
I
you
was,
go about it,
yeah,
this
I
discovery?
feel very fortunate. Laura Cummings, my first mentor, was from the Far East. So she was embedded mostly in Mahayana Buddhism. So she really introduced me to the rudiments of Buddhism. And so I began to sit in a local Zen center and studying Zen. Along the way, I was introduced to a Taoist master from China who instructed me in what I would call the Taoist tradition of yoga and all the different interior exercises, we might say, of manipulating energy, but also exploring who we are at our fundamental level. Then I found my way actually to studies in Chennai in 1980 with T.K.V. Desikachar and his father, T. Krishnamacharya. And through him really was exploring the teachings of Patanjali, Sankhya, and the rudiments of Advaita. Then in 1983, I was introduced to an extraordinary mentor, Jean Klein, who had spent many years in India, had realized his own essential nature, came back to the West, and I met him when he was traveling through San Francisco. And he really was a pure Advaitic teacher. Subsequently, I also had studies with a fellow in India, in Mahabaleshwar, a fellow by the name of Dada, who was a realized Advaitic teacher. And along with many, many others, I feel very fortunate to have had exquisite mentors who didn't teach me intellectually. They really asked me what was my direct experience. While they were asking me what was my direct experience, of course, I was diving deeply into all the readings of the books from Sankhya to Patanjali to Shankaracharya, all the teachings of Advaita, Nisargadatta Maharaj, Ramana Maharshi. Plus, I came from a Judeo-Christian Protestant background at one time, almost going into the ministry, but I had a teacher who convinced me to stay with my yoga studies, which I ended up doing. But it was nice to see how there's a singular thread I began to see through all these teachings. I was always interested in what was the common thread that all these teachings had in common. And actually, it was when I was really profoundly introduced to the teachings of Kashmir Shaivism and the teachings of Yoga Nidra that I began to really see the thread through my studies in Mahayana and Zen, to my studies in Taoism and Patanjali, Advaita, Kashmir Shaivism. I really began to feel this underlying thread that they all had in common, and began to formulate my own understanding, which ultimately has become what is now known as I-REST, which I can speak a little bit about the history of how that happened. But really, for me and all these teachers, they really helped me, number one, have my own direct experience, but also looking at the underlying essence that all these teachings had in common. So it feels to me now I can pick up any of the books And in a manner of speaking, they're all saying the same thing, which is know thyself. And any good book, whether I've found it to be the Bhagavad Gita, the Bible, the Quran, they all say the same thing. Look inside yourself and discover the truth of who you really are and the truth of what everyone is.
Wonderful, Richard Jim. You mentioned about the need for integration between the Western psychology, the modern psychology, and the Indic psychology, Indic knowledge systems such as yoga, Vedanta, Tao, etc. So, can you elaborate a bit more about the convergences and divergences between Western psychology and Bharatiya psychology from yoga, Kashmiri Shaivism, Vedanta-based psychology?
Yeah. Ultimately, I think of all these teachers, whether it was Patanjali or Buddha or Shankaracharya, to me, they were all exquisite psychotherapists. They knew the root cause of suffering, and they were more interested in helping a person relieve their suffering than expounding philosophically, although the teachings really do have a deep philosophy behind them. With often that I found with some of my teachers from the East, they emphasize the aspect of awakening, enlightenment, but they didn't really completely understand how to resolve psychological suffering from trauma or depression or anxiety. Over on the Western side, I found exquisite ways of helping people with anxiety and depression and trauma, but often what was ignored in the Western psychology was the deeper aspects of spirituality and how is it possible that we're all interconnected. It became really important to me to see not to either do a psychological bypass or a spiritual bypass, but to look at the interweaving of these. So for me, then, the word psychology and spirituality in a way fell away. And I was just really beginning to see, how do we become really good human beings? And as I really helped the person not try to fix themselves, not try to change themselves, but like I was doing with my own inner exploration, inquire into their own firsthand direct knowledge of themselves. And I found that both in some ways from the Western psychology, it was always emphasizing something's wrong. How do we fix it? On the Eastern side, they were saying, we're already whole and complete. We don't need to worry about the psychology, just experience this which is whole and already awake within us. So I felt that each was leaving out something about the other. And so as I peeled off the label spiritual and peeled off the label psychology, I really just helped begin people to meet themselves in their own inquiry. And to me, when we have an issue like sadness, depression, grief, anger, trauma, psychologically, we need to understand, this is my own understanding, that the symptoms that we're experiencing are simply messengers that are trying to get our attention to see where we've separated in some way from our experience. We're denying an emotion. Maybe in our family or our culture, we're taught not to have anger or to be strong when we feel fragile. So I really began to realize that trying to fix or change ourselves psychologically was not the way. The way was really a way of inquiring into how were we separating at some level with deeply in ourselves. I ran into a beautiful sutra from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which said, whenever we separate from ourselves in any way, there will be some modicum of stress, distress, anxiety, or fear. And the farther we separate, the stronger those symptoms will become. So I began to help people psychologically inquire, where are you separating? So when they felt anger or sadness or grief or trauma, look within and see where you're denying something. And as they came into touch with that within which they were denying or separating from, we found healing occurred. And in that moment of reparation, the depression or the anxiety fell away. But quite often, as I asked them, is there anything else here that you haven't reported on? They would often say, now that that has fallen away, there's this incredible presence, stillness, silence. And as I had them inquire into that, it began that process that we would call spiritual awakening as they deepened extraordinarily into deeper and deeper places within themselves. At the same time, when I was working with people, because I began teaching meditation and yoga, and people were seeking me out spiritually, as I helped them inquire into their spiritual aspect, this that has never been hurt, harmed, injured, is always whole, is always awake. We just need to realize it. As they began to awaken, their psychological aspects began to show up. So I was able to work from both ends, we might say, into the middle, helping people both deepen into their spiritual aspect, but also resolve their psychological aspects. And so I found this integration to be so very important, where now I see the Eastern teachings really can inform the Western teachings. The Western teachings can inform the Eastern teachings. So we don't deny our psychology, and we don't deny our deep essence that we all have in common.
That is a very fascinating, very wonderful explanation, Richard G. I mean, this is a very fascinating subject. A connected question to this, as a perhaps a follow-up question, is how the notion of consciousness plays into this whole thing. In my very limited understanding, while in the Indian traditions, the consciousness is uh, treated as a subject, not as an object. But in modern science, to my new limited knowledge, mostly treats consciousness, evolution of consciousness, as a product of some physical or brain chemistry, or a product of the brain, so to speak. So I find this to be two diametrically opposite positions. What are your thoughts on this?
I agree. We have this very materialistic view where consciousness is predicated on the brain. Without the brain, no consciousness. And then the other side of the coin, which is that the body and the brain are in consciousness. Consciousness pervades, but doesn't need a body or a brain. What I'm seeing as quantum physics meets psychology and spirituality, they're beginning to realize in new ways that we might say the body is in consciousness, the mind is in consciousness, the brain is in consciousness. But consciousness is something other than the body and the mind. I love where this comes in from the Pratyabhija or Trika school of Kashmir Shaivism, which looks at everything as an expression of an underlying mystery. Call it God, call it the divine, call it Parabrahman, whatever we want to call it, but some essence that then gives rise to consciousness and to a body and to a mind. And that is the view that I've come to respect and understand, where now it resolves the paradox, which is, if everything comes from an underlying essence, then the material body is a part of that essence, not separate. But we can look at it and study it as if it were, but we understand that it's not. And that consciousness and awareness are also expressions of that underlying essence. We can study them as if they're objective, but we also see that they're not, they're interrelated. So I don't hold to the materialist's view that consciousness is predicated only on a body. To me, what is it that holds an atom together? It is a mysterious force. We can call it consciousness. I like the word mystery because when we say something like consciousness, we can almost try to get a hold of it. But if we say mystery, it kind of flows through our fingers. But whatever we want to call it, if we really look at these deeper questions, where did everything come from? How did we get here, and what holds everything together? When we look at the body, it's made out of atoms, but if we explore an atom, all we come up with is vast, spacious openness, as the quantum physics know. If we go into any material object, we come out into vast, open spaciousness. And so I see that the body is basically contracted space. That's a view that the quantum physicists often say, that what is a material object but compressed space? If it were to completely release, everything would dissolve back into its inherent spaciousness. So if I can trace back for a moment with you, if we feel the body and our emotions, our body sensations, and our thoughts, aren't they all in our awareness? So we can see how, in a manner of speaking, we're not just in the body, but the body's really unfolding in our awareness, in our consciousness. So then if we ask, what is consciousness? We have a sense of awareness of consciousness. But then as we settled into simply being, say, awareness or consciousness itself, separate from the objects that are arising in it, body, mind, senses, and world, and we really explore our direct experience of awareness or consciousness, it leads us to feel that there's something else here we cannot name, but we can experience, that I would say is the birthing ground of the entire cosmos. And then as we sit that, we can go the other way and watch how out of that comes awareness, consciousness, the material objects, body, senses, mind. And so it's really interesting to play back and forth, to move out into the world that's concrete and then dissolve the world back into our conscious awareness. And we all, don't we, look forward to a night of restful sleep where we don't dream, we go back, we might say, where the mind, the body, senses, everything disappears. And I would say we rest at home in our most essential nature. And we all look forward to that. So is it possible as we come back from deep sleep, we keep that quality that we discovered there and live with it during the day? And if we do, I think we will all lose all fear of death. All anxiety will drop away because we know then where we came from and where we will be going back to sooner probably than later for all of us. But that's a little, maybe I ramble a little bit, but that's how I would speak to your inquiry there.
I think these in these ramblings are hidden lot of gems of insight, and I could hear many parallels with Sri Aurobindo's philosophy in those thoughts. Very interesting. Please tell us about your institute, iRest Institute, and its activities. especially the iRest Yoga Nidra meditation program, what it is and why you chose Yoga Nidra as the core of your program and how it is helpful to people. Tell a bit about this.
Well, as I mentioned back in 1970, I had my first experience of what I would call Yoga Nidra coming through the teachings of Swami Satyananda and his integral yoga. So I began to explore it myself. I got introduced to the Bihar school and the teachings of Satyananda. But I looked at the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, a lot of the ancient texts, the Mandukya, the Taittiriya, and I began to explore this 5 kosha model that Yoga Nidra often comes out of. And in the 70s and 80s, I was using the teachings that I had received from Satyananda and from, or Satchitananda and from Satyananda. But as I explored my students' experiences, I realized that the teachings I had been given were really predicated on concepts coming out of the East in India. And I was given visualizations to ask my students to have and different experiences, which they were able to have. But there came a moment where instead of saying to them, this is the experience to have, I began to ask them, what is the experience that they're having? So I began to strip off the cultural trappings, I would say, and began to look at what's the underlying essence of this practice called Yoga Nidra. And what I began to realize, it's an exploration into 5 koshas. What is this body? What is this energy body? What are my emotions and feelings? What are these thoughts and beliefs? And what is this quality we call joy or happiness? And as I help people just explore on their own these 5 koshas or coverings, they began to spontaneously transcend each one. And then I realized that there was a very specific thought, an I thought, this ego I thought, that was there through all 5 koshas. And in the annals of the sutras, I found a 6th kosha, which I've called the Asmita Maya kosha, which is really a deep exploration of what is this I thought and how does it come to form. And I began to realize that the function of the mind and the senses and the ego are actually to create a sense of separateness where none exists. And that the koshas were kind of layerings we put on body, mind, senses, emotions, thoughts, and joy that covered up our deeper essence. And as we began to deconstruct them, people were starting to get in touch with what I would call this deeper essence. Then in 2004, I was approached by Walter Reed Army Medical Center because they found out about my approach to Yoga Nidra, and they wondered if this might be helpful for military coming back from war or trauma, and could I help them? So I undertook a research study in 2004 at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, which was so successful using my approach of Yoga Nidra that they integrated my program into their healing regimen so that any veteran or active duty soldier coming back with military trauma or some other issue going on, they could have access to my protocol. What was interesting is they came to me early on in the study and said, look, we're military, we don't do yoga, we don't meditate, call it something else, would you, rather than Yoga Nidra, because they didn't know what to do with this word. And so I thought long and hard, and I came up with the word integrative restoration. Integrative because I think the practice helps integrate us psychologically, and restoration because it restores us to its deepest aspect. And back in 2004, 5, and 6, everything was iPad and iPhone. So I thought, why not iRest? I with a little I that's putting the ego in its proper place, and rest for restoring us to that essence. And they came back to me and they said, you know what, we can do iRest. What's funny is a couple of years later, after they had been using my practice of Yoga Nidra as iRest, they came back to me and they said, you know, this is such a powerful tool. We've decided you can call it anything you want. So when I go into a chemical dependency unit, a homeless shelter, military setting, a hospital setting, I call it iRest. When I go to a yoga center, I call it Yoga Nidra. And when I go to a Buddhist center, I call it meditation. What I've found is what word can we use so that we get entree into the setting, and then the practice shows itself, the potency of it. But it's really an inquiry now. iRest is an inquiry into the body through body sensing, the energy body, the prana body through breathing and sensing, looking at our feelings and emotions, not trying to fix or change them, but get to know them so that we are no longer repressing, suppressing, but really responding harmoniously. Same thing with our thoughts and beliefs, and to joy, and ultimately seeing through this I thought that creates a sense of separation where in fact there really isn't one. So now we can be awake through these practices of what I've called iRest or Yoga Nidra. We can be awake to our essence while celebrating what we might call differences. So we've integrated and don't keep them as separate. We can live in a dualistic framework. At the same time, we are in a non-dualistic framework. They're not separate. They're just different sides of the same coin. And both are necessary for us to traverse the world, isn't it? We need to have some sense of separation so I can pick up a glass of water and take a drink or relate to you, but at the same time, knowing that the cup and I aren't separate and I'm not separate from you, the two go together in a very wonderfully integrative way. And there came the iRest Institute as a nonprofit to train teachers. So the Institute, we think of ourselves as a university where we're training teachers in this exquisite practice we call Yoga Nidra, and also a deeper framework where we look into the teachings of Sankhya, Patanjali, Advaita, and Kashmir Shaivism as an integration of the deeper teachings out of which this practice emerges. But we're also teaching elements of psychology as well as spirituality, so that we're trying to create a holistic package of teachings that really cover all the bases for the people who come to us to learn.
Amazing. Integrative restoration. I think that's a wonderful way of putting it. You mentioned about the how you change the terminology based on the audience. I think this falls into a larger issue. I want your what are your thoughts on? Is the currently little bit controversial issue of cultural appropriation. I mean, there are
Correct.
a lot of issues around that wherein teachings from a different cultural setup, Eastern cultural setup, are taken. And sometimes they are stripped of the cultural trappings, as you said, and without acknowledgement of the roots. I think we see this phenomenon very often. So how do you ensure in your teachings, in your interaction, in your programs, that this derooting of this these teachings from their knowledge traditions and their holistic identity, holistic essence is maintained?
Now, this is a very important question. When we teach at our institute, we do our trainings, our retreats, our immersions and workshops, we always showcase the depth of the teachings that what we teach emerges from. That's why it's very important to me to be teaching and understand the rudiments and the depth teachings of Sankhya, Patanjali, Advaita, Kashmir Shaivism, so that we're really showing people the roots out of which these teachings come. At the same time, we want to be able to approach anybody from respecting their background, their culture, their socioeconomic status, whoever they are, and so that we give them the teachings that they need at the level that they can understand. When I first met Desikachar, one of the first things he said to me, he said, I want you to understand when you meet a student, you need to first understand what they want and then understand what they need so that you can give them enough of what they want so they stick around as you're really giving them what they need. If I go into a military center and they said, what are you doing here? And I say, I'm teaching Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, I'm teaching Kashmir, they'll kick me out. They'll laugh me out of the room. If I tell them that I'm helping them work with their trauma, they'll keep me in the room. If I go into a Buddhist center and I say I'm only going to do psychology, they may not want me. I think it's important that we understand the audience and the person we're working with so we can really speak to them out of their own language. We're not imposing them. We're really helping give them tools for their own self-inquiry to come to their own direct knowledge. So while I think it's very important that we don't misappropriate teachings and we show where they come from, and I always try to leave breadcrumbs, whatever I do, so people can trace it back to the root teachings. I really do, when I meet a person, I meet them fresh. I try to find out what do they want, what do they need, how do they use language that I can use to speak back to them so that they can receive what I have to give and not prematurely reject it. I do like what the Dalai Lama said to the scientists, which is, if you have something that I can understand and it changes my view of Buddhism, I'd love to hear it. In turn, if I have something from Buddhism that would help you understand, are you open to hearing it? So how do we cultivate openness? And also, in a manner of speaking, haven't we all taken teachings, and as one of my dear teachers, were actually both Desikachar and Jean Klein, said to me, make it your own. These are timeless teachings that we've been given by the ancients that we need to adapt for modern times so that modern people can take up the teachings. And so what I see is a continual adaptation of the teachings. I see Kapila revolutionized the teachings of Sankhya. Patanjali took those and brought them into the Yoga Sutras. The Buddha was probably, taking up the teachings of Sankhya because he was born in Kapilavastu, where the teachings of Sankhya came out of. So he was exposed to both the yoga teachings and Sankhya, yet he made them into a very new kind of teaching for the world at that time. Shankaracharya revitalized the teachings into what we now know as Advaita. So what I see is we're all taking these teachings, hopefully from our direct experience, making them our own, and then bringing them into the world in a way that people can hear them. So again, I would never wish to appropriate something that isn't mine or call it mine, or it's not mine. These are ancient perennial teachings that we all are privy to. They don't belong to anyone, and they don't belong ultimately to any culture. We are one human race. So can we put down, as one of my dear teachers, Jiddu Krishnamurti, said, I'm not a Hindu, I'm not an Indian, I'm not an American, I'm not a Westerner, I'm not an Easterner, I'm a human being living out of my direct experience. Can we heal all these boundaries of separation and really support each other in taking these teachings and bringing them out in ever new ways? But scratch the surface, it's always the same teaching that we're giving. So that's the way I would answer that. I respect the teachings I've received, the precious teaching from India. I respect it highly. I always want to let people know where they came from. And yet I also want to respect the people that I'm teaching to make sure that they don't feel I'm imposing some philosophy on them. I'm really trying to have them come to their own direct experience and their own awakening to this deep truth that doesn't belong to anybody.
Excellent. I think that is a very balanced approach to the very complicated, very sensitive issue. I'm very glad to have this clarity from you. You
Can I
mentioned,
add one more thing here? Because
yes,
what I've seen is, and again, this is long talks I had with Desikachar, interactions with Krishnamurti and other of my teachers. I've been accused by many people of creating an institute where I'm just trying to make money. And I say to people, the teachings are always free. There's no price we can ever put on the teaching. So if a person doesn't have any money, I say, come, I'll give you the teachings. Where we charge is to keep the lights on, to pay our insurance, to give our workers a living wage so that we can give the teachings out. And I think we need to look at this issue around money and spirituality. We all need to make a living. Things for me are always freely given. There's no monetary price to put on these teachings. And we're in a different age here now, say in the West, where people don't understand the relationship of the ancients to a teacher or a guru. So we have to make our own way to, again, for me, as a psychologist, I was able to make my living, raise my children, send them to school. I didn't depend on money from the spiritual teachings. They've always been free. And it's the same thing with my institute. We always give them freely, and we need to keep on the lights. So we respect that money and spiritual teachings are not opposites. They need to, again, be integrated and understood.
thank you, Richard, for the wonderful, very fascinating conversation on many aspects of Western psychology, Eastern uh, thoughts on self, consciousness, and so many things, as well as cultural appropriation and many other issues. We are on the behalf of entire Advaita Academy. All of our audience, I thank you for the time.
Well, it's a delight being here with you. Absolutely. And I hope this helps those who are listening in some small way.
I'm sure all of our audience will be watching this interview. They will be hugely benefited from this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure.
Yes, with this, we conclude this session. Follow us on